to follow up with everyone after the webinar too. So to get started, I'd like to welcome our speakers for today, Linda Kannenberg and Sonya Bhonsle. Linda is a senior climate strategy consultant at South Pole and has over 8 years of professional experience in advising international companies and NGOs on their greenhouse gas footprint, target setting, and supplier sustainability engagement strategies. Before South Pole, Linda worked at CDP, the German offsetting NGO Atmosphere, and taught CSR and sustainability management to economics students. She also holds a doctoral degree in economics and focused her research on integrated reporting and accounting. Sonya Bhonsle is the Global Head of Value Chains and Regional Director of Corporations at CDP. She leads all of CDP's corporate activity in the UK and worldwide region. Sonya will be helping us talk about carbon disclosure and how this leads to raised corporate climate ambition. Linda is going to start the session today, and Sonya will be rounding off the agenda before we start. Welcome again, Linda. I'm going to hand over to you now to get us started. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Helen, for the introduction, and also a very warm welcome from my side. So let's start off with a few words about South Pole, right? So our more than 500 experts around the world help companies like yours to reduce climate change impacts, mitigate risks, and create value along your sustainability journey. We were founded around 15 years ago, are headquartered in Zurich, and we are the largest global developer of certified emission reduction, avoidance, and removal projects. And speaking of sustainability journey, on the next slide, you can basically see that we, on the next slide, consult companies in measuring their footprint and their risks. So basically, we help you to understand your carbon footprint. We also help you set a roadmap and create targets, such as science-based targets. We help to reduce your footprint, so we will investigate any potential reduction interventions, related costs and emissions, obviously, that can be reduced. We also help support finance climate action, for example, through the avoidance or removal of unavoidable emissions or investing in impact funds. And we can also help you engage your stakeholders in your sustainability journey, communicate the results. Obviously, communicate and lead, this last part is often overlooked, but similarly important. And on the next slide, on the agenda, today we're going to tell you more about the current state of net zero commitments and how the upcoming COP summit will likely lead to raised ambition among corporates, further accelerating the trend in target setting. We will also tell you on how to set a net zero target and a science-based target, just very practical things with credible interim milestones, and how the Science-Based Targets Initiative criteria have changed recently. After presenting 2 best practice cases of firms that we have set SBTs for, I will then hand over the word to Sonya, who will explain to you how important regular disclosure of your targets framework is, and who actually might even be looking at what you disclose and which targets you have set exactly. You've probably noticed that there's a rapidly growing number of governments, not only, but also corporates, obviously, globally making public net zero commitments. These commitments not only cover 61% of global GHG emissions, it is also estimated that at least 1/5 of the world's largest 2,000 public companies have set net zero commitments. And among these are brands that we all know, like Apple, Microsoft, Unilever, Nestle, and many others. But today we want to elaborate a bit more on what does it actually mean to set a net zero target, and how can your organization raise its ambition. And let's start from the beginning of the story on the next slide, and that one. So really explaining where the term net zero stems from, or at least when it started to gain momentum. Around 2 years ago, the IPCC's special report on the impacts of global warming was released and detailed what is needed to transition to a 1.5 degrees Celsius world. And that's massive emission reductions, no surprise, and even negative emissions. The point where we balance all emissions with an equivalent amount of emissions absorbed from the atmosphere is called net zero. But the journey doesn't end there. We do need to reach net zero by mid-century, and from then onwards, we actually need negative emissions, meaning absorbing more than is emitted in order to stay on the 1.5 trajectory. So limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century is still within reach, but it does require transformational change, as was just outlined by the 6th assessment of the IPCC that was just published a couple of weeks ago. On the next slide, the concept of net zero is nicely shown. So here you see the global emissions. In yellow, you see a business as usual emissions trajectory, or the current status quo, basically. The red dotted line indicates the net zero emissions, or the pathway that we want to be on in order to limit global warming to maximum 1.5 degrees Celsius, and in line actually with the SBTi's criteria. In light blue, you then see the so-called residual emissions here. Now you can see that business as usual emissions are decreasing from today onwards via actual emission reductions. So on the one hand, you are hopefully already actively reducing your emissions, for example, through the purchase of renewable energy. On the other hand, you can address your residual emissions through so-called carbon avoidance projects. So for example, in the form of buying carbon credits. Here, a company finances emissions reductions outside of the value chain via compensation, or also known as offsetting, and thereby could even claim climate neutrality today. Now, if we move a little bit more to the right of the chart, it becomes clear that the residual emissions have to be neutralized with CO2 removals to reach net zero in 2050, depicted here by the dark blue area. And carbon removals, or so-called negative emissions, are anthropogenic activities, again, that remove CO2 from the atmosphere and actually store it permanently. You might have heard of some interesting innovations here and there where companies or startups are trying that, or big investors are investing in those solutions. But it really doesn't stop there. Beyond 2050, there might still be some reduction potential by the company due to new technologies or so on. And in order to create so-called negative emissions, a company will have to remove more emissions from the atmosphere than it emits. And on the next slide, I just want to really showcase how COP26 will play a key role in accelerating the development of corporate net zero pathways, and already now leads to raised ambition among companies, as we're actually noticing. They're already, using the momentum and want to pay attention to their own emissions and targets. And during this upcoming 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference in Scotland in November, countries are expected to increase the ambitions of their nationally determined contributions, which has also been abbreviated with NDCs sometimes. And they're urged to turn the Paris Agreement into credible climate policies and legislated objectives. This, among many other positive outcomes, which we all hope for, would provide certainty for future investments and actually incentivize the private sector to step up and adjust to a net zero world, which is step 2 here in this graph. This private finance, which is being mobilized, will then help companies to realign their business models for a net zero world by funding innovations and, for example, through developing new market structures, right? Market incentives such as fees, lures, etc., taxes. And access to public and private funding at the same time then by corporates will depend upon credible climate targets. So in step 3 here, companies are expected to increasingly set science-based targets, also abbreviated as SBTis, as the de facto standard of target setting. And SBTs to provenly drive decarbonization. Between 2015 and 2020, companies with validated targets actually cut emissions by 25%. So the proven effectiveness of SBTs does accelerate the transition to net zero and corroborates, in turn, stricter climate policies again. So step 5 here. So you can almost think of it as not only like a linear process, but like a virtuous circle in a way, because it all feeds into each other if done right. On slide 13, the next slide, and I'm sure you're all aware of the Science Based Targets Initiative, so I won't go into detail too much in this and the criteria. However, we do want to touch upon some key changes in criteria that will become effective July 15th of next year. But if you're already planning to set SBTs now, we did want to make sure to cover this because it is important and it is the criteria that you should pay attention to. So for example, when you look at your scope 1 and 2 emissions, your direct emissions, right? You need to make sure that these are aligned with a 1.5 degree scenario reduction path. Climate targets for scope 1 and 2 with a lower ambition will no longer be accepted. In addition, the time frame for meeting the temperature targets is also shortened from 15 to 10 years. And if you already have approved science-based targets, the initiative obviously encourages you to upgrade your targets as soon as possible. And if you plan to commit to the SBTi shortly, and again, if you commit, you have around 2 years to then hand in your targets for validation. But if you plan to communicate this commitment via a commitment letter to the SBTi, you could try to do so by September 30th, because in order to be showcased during the COP in November, this is basically the deadline until when you have to send that letter. So these are some of the main kind of insights and changes of the criteria in a nutshell. On the next slide, I want to go a bit more into detail on some other parts. So apart from a raised ambition level for scope 1 and 2, the minimum scope 3 SBT emission is also increasing from previously what was possible a 2-degree scenario. It's been increased to a well below 2-degree scenario, so becoming a bit more ambitious in terms of actual reductions. However, the target boundaries are not affected by this new strategy as communicated until now. You still need to cover 95%, so really the vast majority of your scope 1 and 2 emissions with your target, and 2/3 of your scope 3 emissions. If you have already approved targets, you will have time until the year 2025 to update your targets to be in line with the latest criteria if they were approved in 2020 or earlier. If you had them approved this year, you will need to review and update your target at least every 5 years, basically. So not immediate change is needed, though do look at how it's changed anyhow and how the criteria are updated. On the next slide, another novelty that the SBTi is now introducing is a differentiation between the so-called near-term and long-term SBTs. So whereas near-term SBTs are short-term reduction targets in line with the 1.5 degree Celsius pathways, and they also ensure basically immediate climate action. And if you've been familiar with the SBTi, you know this is what formerly was called kind of like science-based targets. The new differentiation between long-term SBTs is new. It basically describes targets that should be achieved by 2050 at the latest to reach net zero, and also to limit global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius. On another note, the SBTi will begin validating net zero corporate targets from January 2022 onwards, which might also be interesting because we get a lot of queries from companies saying, okay, we do want to set a net zero target, but what's the criteria we should follow? Who could validate it? So the SBTi is planning to do so. And on the next slide, we wanted to show you that setting SBTs is really one thing, but actually staying on track and monitoring progress is another. And here it's important that targets that have been set, usually from the top down, right? They're not developed with all of the teams, and not every team and every single employee is asked, okay, can we actually reach this? So you need to make sure that these are actually aligned with reduction potentials developed from the bottom up. So on the left-hand side here, you see generic reduction path of emissions and how business as usual emissions, which is the blue dotted line, should be reduced to achieve the reduction target, which is the green line here. Now, you can compensate and neutralize emissions. This is the gray and orange here, but in the end, residual emissions need to decrease. Now, this reduction ambition should be complemented with strategic tools that identify and monitor how emissions can be reduced over time, and ideally from the start. And such monitoring tools that identify specific reduction interventions, you can see here depicted on the bottom right of the slide, on the right side. And in this waterfall chart, you see that the base year plus the growth emissions until the target year are reduced by certain interventions, right? Such as energy efficiency measures, clean energy procurement, and so on. And this identification and monitoring over time serves as such a tool to quantify and prioritize reduction potential, as well as costs, right, to ensure the target ambition is met. And the SBTi actually also recommends checking the validity of your target-related projections even annually. And so it really does make sense to have any kind of monitoring tool in place to make sure you're on track. On the next slide, we wanted to show you how the biggest chunk of work when it comes to setting net zero targets and implementing actual reduction interventions within your company obviously lies within your company. However, South Pole can certainly support you on every step of the way. And here we just wanted to outline some steps to you that you would need to follow to not only set SBTs, but also to achieve it. So in the first step, you naturally review your baseline emissions, which means you're analyzing your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. You're calculating them, analyzing them. You make sure that everything is aligned with the GHG protocol, as well as with the SBTi and net zero criteria in that sense. So for example, if I mentioned before, 95% of your scope 1 and 2 emissions need to be covered by the science-based target. You need to make sure that you have a good understanding of your total 100% emissions, right? We also advise our clients on any potential current and future business changes that might materially influence their GHG footprint. So we're looking at projected growth and how that might affect certain business units and emissions in general. In the second step, you then set targets. So this requires some decisions, such as on the type of the target, so whether it should be an absolute, an intensity, or potentially even a supplier engagement target, all under the SBTi. You need to decide on specific target time frame and the actual ambition, so how much you want to reduce. And here we also usually present a couple of options to our clients, as well as a high-level roadmap on how to achieve those targets. Thirdly, carbon interventions are then identified. I briefly touched upon that in the previous slide, but they're basically any activities or measures, right, that decarbonize the carbon hotspots in your company. South Pole has an existing repository of common interventions. However, we also research new ones because, as you can imagine, they're very specific to your business, to your sector, to the materials you purchase, etc. We also look at, how this might impact any specific business units, but also the costs that might be connected to it. And the outcome of this step should be basically a list of interventions, associated decarbonization charts, and implementation costs. And lastly, South Pole can also support you with identifying neutralization or potentially compensation options as a stepping stone towards neutralization later on. And you could then use the suggested roadmaps for engagement with, for example, the finance team. We also develop, for example, certain climate funds, right? So activating finance investments internally, for example, through internal carbon pricing mechanisms, through which then you could finance any real reductions. Okay, and on the next slide, and before handing the word over to Sonya, let me just quickly present two companies to you that I wanted to showcase here and that have set their SBTs with South Pole. The first one is Turner & Townsend, a UK-based professional services company. And the focus with Turner & Townsend was obviously first to set a GHG emissions inventory, which forms the basis of the SBT setting process, which I elaborated on before, and any subsequent emission reduction potentials. And South Pole supported Turner & Townsend with calculating their emissions inventory and advising on the SBT setting process. We designed certain feasible emission reduction measures with the teams, also looking into other departments, to meet their 1.C aligned targets, and we provided advice on offsetting, supplier engagement, renewable energy procurement, and also communicating the net zero target then in the SBT. For a second case, on the next slide, we worked together with Bayersdorf, and here the goal was to design a strategy to manage deforestation risks and investigate positive impacts in the palm oil supply chain, because the company has a very complex agricultural supply chain and sources mostly palm-based derivatives. We also supported them with their annual CDP reporting to improve scores and delivered renewable energy solutions to achieve current targets. And because this is all connected, as some of you might know, because Bayersdorf has reported on CDP that they anticipate setting science-based targets in the next few years as a strong signal also to investors. It also makes sense for them to set science-based targets, which is then what we supported them with. We also identified deforestation hotspots surrounding palm oil mills, from which the client sources, provided some recommendations, and actually used this as well for their SBT roadmap, because the issues of, and Sonya has actually just told me this before, it's very closely connected, and it's becoming more and more connected, right? The topic of water security, deforestation, and emissions. So this is something that we also see, which is increasingly being more kind of connectedly also being contracted with us, and where we can support companies with. Okay, but with that, I actually do want to pass on the word to Sonya Bhonsle from CDP.
Great. Can you see me and can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Linda. What fascinating and really comprehensive. You made it sound quite simple, which actually setting an SBT isn't. So I very much congratulate you on that. I present about them a lot. But I'm not here to talk about that. I'm going to be talking a bit about the trends that we're seeing at CDP around disclosure and tracking targets. So I have 10 minutes and I will be told off if I go over them. So if we go on to the first slide. Hopefully most of you know who CDP is. If I was in a room and it wasn't a COVID days, I'd ask you to put your hands up. But for those of you who don't know, we're a not-for-profit organisation that collects environmental information from companies on behalf of their customers and investors. We do this on an annual basis. We're over 2 decades old, and we were pretty much founded on the idea that what is measured is managed. And what I'm going to do is talk to you a little bit about the trends we're seeing coming out of the left-hand side box, the investors and the purchasers, and what they're thinking about when they're looking at companies that are reporting through CDP and how that's shifted over time. So if we go on to the next slide. Okay, I think the first thing that I want to mention is that transparency has become much more of a business norm from when we started. You can see here some of our first numbers. That one goes back to 2003. See, you can see how small it was. The concept of being transparent about your environmental impacts, your climate change impacts, it was considered relatively niche. Since then, you can see that it's become a lot more mainstream. We've seen growth of disclosure year on year. And that's because there was a growing recognition of the impacts of climate change and the material impacts that they present to companies, the increased interest of investors, the increased interest of customers. Now, as that's grown, the story of what these investors and purchasers have been looking at in terms of their disclosure, that's also grown with it. I don't know if any of you, I'd love to know if any of you have been around doing CDP for more than 2 decades, but around the pre-2010, we used to have a score called a disclosure score, which was generally a number that investors wanted to understand how much of the CDP questionnaire you filled out, how transparent have you been, and they'd encourage companies to be more and more transparent about different parts of their operations. Around the midpoint, investors particularly started asking questions about, well, they're being transparent, but are they any good? And that's when we brought in the performance letter grade. And then that went on for a couple of years and we had 2 scores, and investors said, oh, you know what, we can let the disclosure one go. We feel that they understand the need to be transparent. We need the data and we need to understand their performance. That has then grown from there on. So when you're looking at disclosure and targets, setting the right ambition, setting the ambition that's aligned with IPCC, everything that Linda said, 1.5 is really important. Tracking progress to it is gonna be the next step. And they are looking, I can tell you that much, because I see them quite a lot. And they like to ask us questions. I've been on panels where investors tell fun stories about how they take their tablet and are flicking through the CDP disclosure saying, but it says you're not SBT, because you know, they're actively looking at what people are reporting to us. And science-based targets has formed a core part of that. But I just wanted to just echo one thing that Linda said, and Linda, this is slightly off my slide topic here. That example you brought up of Beiersdorf and bringing in deforestation and water and how that's part of the climate target, that's actually pretty much a theme that's ripping through Climate Week in New York at the moment and is coming through strongly in the bit to COP. These bar charts here show climate change, water, deforestation. They're actually not separate things, they're all tied together. For many companies, their forest target will impact on their science-based target. Any sort of adaptation planning needs to include water security. Any sort of innovation on water security may have an impact on water, on energy usage and the need for sourcing more renewables. So it's all interconnected. And the investors are getting a lot more sophisticated on that. But I won't go down that particular rabbit hole unless I get a question through it on the chat, but that is strongly coming through. So I want to really echo what Linda said there. If we go on to the next slide, let's look at what investors are saying about SBTs. Oh no, I need to tell you how many are doing SBTs, apologies. I was at Paris when we launched SBTs, SBTi launched the SBTs, and I remember being in a variety of different events where we were speaking, and I remember, you know, being really excited. It's like, we've got our 10th person, they've signed up, Walmart's in, and L'Oreal's in, and I remember that. And look how it's grown in those 5 years. 1,700 companies have set SBTs. 883 have them approved. 764 have aligned to business ambition for 1.5. As said right at the beginning, this is definitely the way the corporates are approaching setting climate targets at the moment. And I did a panel, I think it was with BT, and I've been asked many times, well, what's the success of this? I can tell you the success of this particular science-based targets concept wasn't that it's easy to do. Anyone who's gone through that process would 100% agree. It's not. It's a hard bit of work, but that's the point. It's a worthwhile bit of work. Prior to science-based targets, people were setting targets. An example of a company, and I'm not allowed to name them, was their operations team went away and they thought, oh, we could probably do 17% by 2020. Then the marketing team were past it, or the comms team, they said, well, this is fun, but wouldn't 20 by 2020 sound nicer? It's rhyming. And then they'd set these targets, and for many companies, they were actually quite stretching targets. But then nobody, whether they met it or not, nobody really understood how it related to the climate challenge we're all facing. So by setting a science-based targets, you're able to say, we heard the IPCC, we understand our role, we've gone through a lot of trouble to understand our role, and we've set targets in line with science. I think that's the proliferation here. That's the message that investors and customers are picking up on. So if you go on to the next slide, let's talk a little bit more about the investors. So this is a quote from Schroders. They have been tracking the proliferation of science-based targets through CDP. And SBTi, quite a few of these different targets suggest reporting through CDP to communicate ambition, but even if they don't mandate it. But here you have, this is a beautiful quote from Schroders, and I've actually been on many panels with them, but different people. The investors understand climate change. They understand that it's going to affect businesses. They can see what's coming with COP. They can see that the people entering the job market are being more distinguished about the way they are approaching the roles that they're taking. They're more aware of what they're buying. And so they can see how this might. Do you remember this concept of stranded assets? It came out of the Rolling Stones magazine, of all places, years ago. So they understood this. So they understand that it's there, they know it's to be accepted, but what they use CDP data is to understand how to tackle what's going on in their portfolios. And for many of them, they've been using the data, the emissions data, to look at what their portfolio footprints are. But now they want to know where that portfolio footprint's going, and that's why they're tracking SBTs. If you go to the next slide. Oh, there we go. They actually, I think it was about 3 years ago, started a project. So the investors came to us and said, look, we want to see more SBTs. The CDP said, yeah, brilliant, so do we. And Linda was talking a bit about a virtuous circle here. We all know the number of SBTs should go up. So investors started to engage with companies to drive up the adoption of SBTs. They would send a letter to high impact companies asking them to commit to a science-based target. And this year they've gone a bit further and said a 1.5 aligned SBT. So they would ask, they've been writing letters to them. The number of companies have actually responded to this, and many of you might have even received this letter. The number of companies have started to increase setting SBTs. Now, from their perspective, that means that there is a larger investable universe aligned with the Paris Agreement, which allows them to feel more confident in their own targets, but it also means that they can start to pull it as a KPI. As more and more people are doing it, it becomes a more easily mainstreamed KPI. If there's only 10 companies, go back to that Paris example, the investors couldn't really use it as a differentiator because you'd only be investing in 10 companies. Now we're getting to the 1700 stage. Now we're starting to see that they are using it as a differentiator, and it's giving them the confidence to set their own SBTi because they now have their own methodology. And then that takes you up to, well, we've set this target, we want more to happen, and that virtuous circle. The more that companies are setting it, the more confident the investors feel, the more they encourage the companies to set it, the more companies do set. Perfect circle. Go on to the next slide. And it's been impressive, that particular campaign, and now in its 4th year, or maybe 3rd year, the amount of investors has increased from about 60%, by about 60% on last year, 222 financial institutions. They have been joined by some purchasers, supply chain members, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about that on my next slide, but keep that in mind. So 222 financial institutions are now engaging with 1,600 companies representing $40 trillion of market cap, not to be sneered at, but here's the key bit. Covering 25% of the global scope 1 and 2, scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions. And they're encouraging them to set SBTs. Now, those companies will be probably, at a guess, the majority of companies that go through this have to set SBTs that include scope 3. So if they're setting that, then suddenly this virtuous circle goes again, because they're now the purchasers that need to engage with the other companies who haven't to meet their target. And then those companies are now those 26, let's just say those 26 1.5 committed supply chain members are the companies that have set them, asking the other companies to. So the purchasers and the investors aligning and tracking who's doing what through CDP, and that comes with the disclosure. Come to the next slide. And it's not new for us. So we, CDP, many of you probably know this, but maybe you don't. We also have a program called the Supply Chain Program. Linda's an affiliate of that, actually, a veteran of CDP. We have 200 companies that represent about $4 trillion of spend that engage with their suppliers. Now, a lot of them are engaging with their suppliers because they want to cascade SBTs down the supply chain. And you can see on the right-hand side, I've put some quotes up here. I won't read them all because I'm going over time. But Lucas Joppa is on the right-hand side. He's Chief Sustainability Officer for Microsoft. And just talking to that slide, previous slide, we have aligned our supplier spend with trillions of investor dollars who also leverage CDP data. This alignment of market signals drivers for our suppliers to focus on disclosing their greenhouse gas emissions and setting emission reduction targets in line with the climate science. That is becoming more and more the message we're getting from the purchasers. We are aligning with the investors. We're asking them to disclose through CDP. We want to see them, A, set science-based targets, B, report progress on an annual basis. So it's funny, Linda, that you have long-term 2050, near-term 2030, but nobody's got time to wait till 2030 to see if people have made it. The tracking year on year is becoming much more common because we need to know, are we on track for 1.5 from an emission perspective? But from a very selfish perspective, these companies that have set 1.5 targets, the majority of them have scope 3. They need to know their suppliers are on track for it as well. So you're going to the next slide. And what started off as a niche group of, so I think previously on that slide I had BT, Stanley, Beck & Decker, just looking at the faces, and Microsoft. What started off as sort of a small group, niche group of companies asking their suppliers to set SBTs, actually grown. And I'm not going to say all of these companies do, because they don't. They don't all have an SBT. They're not all asking their suppliers to. But look at the spread of sectors. Look at the spread of geographies. A lot of them are. And even if they haven't set an SBT, and I've been privy to this, I've been on the calls, we do a lot of webinars, they've been saying, look, we're thinking about setting a science-based target. We're committed to setting it. We're giving you a heads up now that once we've got it, we'll be tracking your progress to setting it. So you don't, they're thinking about this now. They're actively engaging with their suppliers now, even if they haven't set it, because they know in the end, to meet their target, they're going to need the support of their supply chain. Last slide, I believe. And I promise I'll stop then. I know I've just hit my 10-minute mark. I talked about the investors and the purchasers. So when you're setting a target, who cares? Your investors and your purchasers. Who else cares? The ones that I've heard, I was doing a fireside chat at a conference with a CEO of a chemicals company called Firmenich, and I asked him, why did you set your SBT? And the answer I got was not what I expected. I expected it to be about investors, customers, efficiency, the mission. And he said talent retention, straight up, talent retention. Getting the graduates of the highest degree, they're becoming more discerning as they enter the job market. And so having a good CSR strategy, having a 1.5 aligned target helps them to communicate that this company is a worthwhile company for joining. Academic, business, policy, government do use this. I've recently been working with a bunch of different policy people because we're, especially in the run up to COP. Little known fact, by the way, if you disclose yours to CDP publicly, your target goes into top left-hand corner, a platform called the Nazca platform, which the policy community can access in the run-up to COP to help build the case for taking, 1.5 and aligned action, because the business community in their country is with them. So a lot of different people are using the data, and this is where I come back to set the key message of my presentation. Set the highest, best quality target you can, 1.5. Communicate it as far and as wide as you can, and then track progress year on year. And you'll be ticking all these boxes, your investors, your customers, even civil society, policy, that they're all watching is basically the gist. All right, I will stop there because I promised I wouldn't go too over. I haven't seen any note to tell me to shut up, but I'm presuming I must be. Would love to have any questions. I hope that was interesting for you all.
Thank you, Linda and Sonya, for your insights. I can see that your words have fired up some interesting questions. So we'll start with our live Q&A. So Linda, I've got a question for you here. Can net zero be achieved without setting a science-based target if the decarbonisation plan is according to science, so following the 1.5 degree trajectory?
Okay, I see where that comes from. Yeah, we did notice that it's not always possible for every single company to get a formally approved SBT by the SBTi. I mean, the colleagues there, they're working on sector-specific guidances, etc. But could be. But the reduction or decarbonization in line with science, and ideally setting an SBT is really an integral part of any net zero target. So from our standpoint, we acknowledge any net zero ambitions, obviously, but if you can, and that your company can basically show that it's reducing emissions at a rate required by science without a formal approved SBT, obviously South Pole still acknowledges that. But that being said, it's difficult. We have so many different net zero claims and commitments out there. Like, how do you really, notice and understand the difference between the quality of those, right? The good thing is that setting an SBT is like, the standard de facto standard and quality mark out there, but really now it's in line with science, even though we know that there's companies that might not be able to somehow get it validated at this point.
And maybe leading on from that as well around quality and scope, there's a question here, to what extent can insetting and offsetting activities be used to achieve SBT or net zero targets?
Yeah, okay, so this is interesting because offsets are obviously concrete GHG reductions happening at a different point, used to compensate for GHG emissions within your companies, right? It's happening somewhere else. It's important to note that these cannot be counted as emissions reductions towards the progress of a company's SBT. So if you submit your SBTs, mentioning offsets doesn't do anything for it getting approved. The SBTi requires companies to set targets based on emissions reductions through direct actions, right, within your own operations or your value chains. However, we really think, and I mean, South Pole is really, as said, the biggest kind of project developer of this globally. So we obviously see a great big importance in offsets at this point, which is particularly useful for companies wishing to finance additional emissions reductions beyond the SBT. So yeah, still definitely growing relevance there. I mean, the offsetting market it's exploding, it's growing, and kind of market volume demand is outweighing supply very quickly. So definitely something to look out for and consider. And regarding insetting, so the definition and accounting methodology of insetting projects is still currently being standardized. I don't know, maybe Sonya knows more here, but I think there's no clear definition yet on what accounts as insetting and what not. And that's why if you hand it into the SBTi, they would basically decide on a case-by-case basis if it's valid. So they might not approve it, they might do, depending on the project, just because it's still a bit up in the air there what qualifies.
And I've got another question here, just about what comes first. So should it be setting a target or should it be developing that reduction roadmap to achieve it?
Yeah, so we've seen both, right? So I mean, obviously setting a science-based target, as hopefully you get from this webinar, is a extremely political thing now, also with COP coming up, but in general, it's really something very political that we've noticed. And sometimes we even drafted roadmaps, we set targets, and we decided together with a sustainability team on like an ambition over weeks and months almost. And then the CE just comes in like, no, whatever, let's just communicate the biggest, the strongest ambition, 1.5, whatever you drafted there. So it's really both. You can communicate and then see how to reduce it. But obviously, we would vote for it. You should have a plan, maybe upfront, on how you're planning to reduce it. And that's also something the SBTi, when you submit your targets, not per default wants to see, right? Like the plan, but it's something that we do, just suggest to also submit a little plan on how you're planning to achieve it.
And then I think this is a question that relates to maybe your presentation, Linda, and just some of the nuance around terminology. What is the difference between neutralization options and also compensation?
Yeah, so that's a good point. So compensation is obviously offsetting, right? So you remove emissions on another part of the world, whereas you are causing them within your company. Whereas neutralization can also go in, like carbon removals or projects. So where you actively, what I said before, actively remove CO2 from the atmosphere at a different point.
And also another question here, this time for you, Sonya, closely linking to maybe COP26 and also Article 6. So What does Article 6 mean for carbon disclosure? Will it make it harder or easier?
It's a good question. So AR6 has kicked a hornet's nest in many different ways. I think what AR6 did was really articulate two things that will come back to disclosure. One is the urgency. And for those of you, hopefully, I mean, I don't know if everyone, we talk about AR6, like AR6, it's an IPCC report, it's a sixth assessment. And what they said within it is they had a few controversial findings. The first was that even if we meet the 1.5 goal, so we do get the emissions to where we want it to be, there's going to be a little bit of an overshoot before the climate can recover almost. So there's going to be a need for adaptation. So what does AR6 mean in terms of disclosure? I think the first thing is, one, back to need to know your ambition is aligned with 1.5 and you're on track to meet it. Two, if the environment's going to be changing even under these circumstances, do you have plans? Now, for those of you that are reporting aficionados, and I'm sure South Pole would happily help you with it, TCFD, scenario planning, things like that is going to become more prevalent. So I think from the carbon reporting is going to be moving a little bit more to the climate reporting, and you're going to see a bit more of a proliferation of the, I just did a very interesting forward for ED, who did a report on the need for more planning around adaptation. So there's going to be, a good transition plan will include mitigation and adaptation. And then that's the last piece. I think you're going to find that a lot more in the long term, over the next 5 years, the types of reporting is going to include some transition plan elements, the governance, mid-term, short-term targets, strategy for how you're going to integrate BO 1.5 into business as usual. Things like that is going to become a lot more, picking up a lot more. Does that answer the question? There will also probably be a proliferation of policy and regulation, but I'm sure you're all aware of that globally.
Thanks, Sonya. We've been doing a lot at looking forwards and kind of to the future. So I've got a question here, which is about historical emissions. So are historical emissions part of any defined target, and should they be considered when creating a net zero target? So Linda or Sonya, maybe you can help with that one.
So when we develop the target, usually we do, when we do this baseline exercise, we don't necessarily look at the previous years just because, with target setting, I mean, some companies might already be doing or measuring their GHG emissions, especially the bigger ones, but many come to us and then it's the first year where we do the GHG inventory exercise with no idea about the past year's emissions, and then we model the target, obviously, with considerations of their projected growth or other things that might happen if they acquire certain other, smaller companies. I mean, there's obviously a lot of consolidation happening, many different companies buying others. So no, this does not need to happen. If we do have this data of previous year's emissions, we obviously look at it. It's always worth analyzing, right? Why did emission sources increase or decrease somewhere? And you can learn from that and use that also for when you, plan any expansions or anything else. So we do look at it, we consider it, but it's not necessary really from a, company perspective and the corporate GHG footprint perspective.
Just building on that, if I'm interpreting that question right, you're probably a company that's like, but we've done so much work. So now we've reduced so many emissions, we want credit for that because that came up an awful lot in the last 5 years. SBTi, you can communicate previous work within your submission. There is space for that. But SBTi is made up of a secretariat of not-for-profit organisations, of which I represent one. So you can communicate that, they will take that into account. If your emissions intensity is typically a lot below that of your counterparts, that they can acknowledge that, but they will still expect you to set stretching targets and hopefully meet them, if that makes sense. Just in case that was the tack that the question was coming out. It might be that I'm just used to the older types of questions.
And we're still getting lots more questions here, which is great. And I think we've got time for a couple more. So a question here for Linda. Do the reduction interventions that we use for achieving our targets need to be certified or verified by a third party?
No, they do not. So you don't need any certification here. I mean, obviously, you know, if you're under certain other targets and that's necessary, I don't know if there's management systems, right? EMAS, ISO, and you're doing something there, maybe, but not under the SBTi. Again, they evaluate target setting based on their methodology, based on their criteria, but supporting documents, as I mentioned before, such as any planned reduction interventions, they can help, you know, you make the case for a successful validation of the submitted target, but it's not needed.
Fab, thank you. Another question here, how does the SBTi take into consideration corporate acquisitions and company growth if the targets have already been set?
Yes, so that's a question, and Sonya, you might know more here than I do, but that's a question that they ask exactly in the submission form, and it's something they do take into consideration, and they ask you how are you planning to deal with it. However, what is also required and what they constantly highlight is you need to do a recalculation of your baseline very, you know, frequently. I think it's even, you know, before it was like every 5 years, but sometimes, you know, they even communicate, double check it, but even now they communicate like check it, I mean, annually, right? Do your annual GHG inventory, and then you see what companies you've acquired and how your footprint has grown accordingly. And if that means you can't reach your absolute target anymore, I mean, that's a pity. There's always the option of intensity target for fast growing companies that you could set. But in general, yeah, it's just submit it now with the status quo and then say what you're planning to do in terms of recalculation and evaluating year on year again.
I mean, Linda's exactly right. And the core bit there is the material impact. Some of the big businesses are constantly buying and selling subsidiaries. So if it's not going to have a substantial effect on your emissions inventory, then the majority approach that CDP is seeing is they absorb it and they try to bring those companies as up to speed as quickly as possible. And if they were poorly performing before, actually that's usually because you've got so much in-house knowledge, there's usually a lot of quick wins, such as switching into renewable energy, if you're in market mechanisms, things like that, to bring those emissions down very quickly. That being said, there have been quite a few occasions where we've seen mergers, where two like-sized companies have come together. In that case, that is a material impact. And we've even seen two companies with SBTs come together. And they have restated, they have gone through the process again, because it will require, if your company has changed a lot through something like that, it will require a little bit more thought and detail.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question before we wrap everything up. A question here, if my supplier has a net zero goal, can our company just claim for net zero for the emissions of the product without needing to neutralize those specific scope 3 emissions? So I think the intricacies of supply chain there.
Yeah, and I think Sonya is the expert here, right? Or should I start? What do you?
Linda, this is your webinar. You go first. I'll happily chime in today. You are the expert.
Sure thing. Yeah, no, and that's actually a question we get a lot, because there is by now, thankfully, in everybody's supply chain, always one, two, probably even more suppliers with SBTs or net zero targets. So if you have suppliers that already kind of decrease, however, all the residual emissions associated with a product that your company purchases, you generally still have to account for those emissions in your GHG inventory, right? You can kind of lower that based on their target. However, you yourself don't have to neutralize these emissions again, as this has already been done by the supplier. So reporting, yes, reducing or whatever, no, you can account for that basically.
Brilliant. I think. Oh, Sonya, over to you.
I was going to say, I'd agree. I mean, it will come back to how you do your calculation methodology. If you're using input-output to do your numbers, that's the hand tie of input-output, because if your spend stays the same, your supplier goes, let's just take RE100, your supplier goes, you know, 100% renewables, but you're still timesing the average sector amount by your spend. So your scope 3 doesn't really change with what your suppliers are doing. That's why we've seen an increase, particularly because of SBTs, an increase, this is probably a different webinar, proliferation of a hybridization of using life cycle data for some products to cover some of their scope 3, using supplier primary data to cover other parts of their spend, and then filling in the gaps with input output, because then you get a more realistic evaluation of what's happening in your supply chain, and that would then be transferred into your scope 3 reporting year on year. So a lot of that will come, Linda's exactly right what she said, but you'll have to think about how you do your scope 3 inventory to make sure that you pull that movement from your supply chain and that hard work that you've done with the engagement of your suppliers into your accounting, to not take credit for it, but yes, no, actually to take credit for it. Okay.
We're going to have to bring the questions to a close now as we're nearly on the hour. Thank you everyone for joining today, and especially to our speakers. We will try and contact everyone afterwards and follow up any unanswered questions. There will also be a follow-up with a recording to the session today. Please check out the South Pole website, where we will also be hosting that link too. So thanks again to Linda and Sonya, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much for holding it, South Pole. Wonderful. Bye everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.